I believe, and I believe this as a scientist, and is that you perceive the world through a structure of value that is essentially a map of the territory. So when you look out at the world, you think, well, there's the world, that's the objective world. But obviously you don't just see the objective world, because we wouldn't have had to develop science to give us a picture of the objective world if you just saw the objective world. Mm-hmm. It's actually pretty damn difficult to formalize an objective picture of the world. So if you don't see the objective world, well, what is it that you see? Well, a lot of what you see, a tremendous amount of what you see, is memory. Like, you don't know that, but your brain uses memory to represent things whenever it can, because seeing the world is unbelievably challenging neurologically. And so we exercise the use of our central vision very selectively. We only look at what's important. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what's important is what's valuable. Well, you don't know that you're making an unbelievably complex, value-laden decision whenever you look at something. It's actually the frame through which you see the world. And it's a map. And the reason for that is, well, you have to do things. You have to get from point A to point B. Now, I derive part of this theory in Maps of Meaning from a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety by Jeffrey Gray. Gray developed a theory of emotion that's predicated on the idea that most of your emotions are experienced in relationship to a goal.
Okay.
And so you establish a goal, then movement towards that goal, or evidence that you could move towards that goal, makes you happy, produces positive emotion, whereas evidence that the goal is invalid or that you're blocked in some way produces negative emotion. Mm-hmm. So you lay this map on the world. It always has a destination point in mind. There's always a destination point implicit in it or explicit in it. So it works as subtly as this, for example. So if you walk into your room and you want to walk towards something to pick it up, and your room is cluttered because you've been careless, all that clutter manifests itself as an obstacle to your goal and produces negative emotion. And you experience that instantaneously, essentially, and automatically. And so part of the reason, that I encourage people to clean up their rooms, let's say, is, well, it's a microcosm of all this. Your room is part of your experience that you have control over. And it's easy to underestimate its significance. But that's a place you can alter. You can set it up for whatever it is that you're doing. Well, what are you doing? Well, that's the first question you have to ask yourself if you're going to set up your room. It's not trivial. It's hard. Genuine ethical virtue is it's the only source of resilience and strength that you have. And it's also the place, as far as I can tell, that the meaning that allows you to set yourself against suffering resides. People talk about life and its meaning, and they say, well, life is meaningless, but people never mean that, because if you're in pain or you're terrified, you're overwhelmed with meaning. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. And it's not a reality you can talk yourself out of easily. And that's particularly true of pain, but it can also be true of anxiety. And so the question is there a reliable source of meaning that you can set against that? And what's its nature, if so? And so here's a way of conceptualizing it to some degree. So I'm currently in a rather remote location in northern Ontario. And one of the advantages to being here is that I can go out on my dock at night and I can look up and see the night sky. And when you see the night sky, when it's pitch black, you are face to face with something as near to the infinite as we can face in a prosaic day-to-day setting. And so there's an experience that goes along with that, and the experience is one of awe and wonder. And awe is a very interesting emotion. Let's say it's unbelievably ancient from a biological perspective. So if you feel awe your hair might stand up on end. And sometimes you get that feeling, chills running down your back, say, when you're listening to music that you particularly enjoy. And that's a variant of the reflex that prey animals have when they see a predator. Their hair stands on end so that they look bigger. Now, of course, they don't know that. So part of that feeling of awe is tied to our ancient mammalian heritage. It's a variation of the response we had to a predator. We're in the face of we're facing something much greater than ourselves. And so, but there's more to it if you think it through, because when you face the night sky, for example, or you face something, you confront something that fills you with wonder and awe, there's also a call to action that's sort of implicit in it. And maybe you think, well, the wolf is calling to the rabbit to be better at defending itself in some sense, to be a better rabbit, because otherwise, man, you're going to be eaten by the wolf. And when you look up in the night sky, to the night sky, and you feel awe, there's a call there. It's part of that experience to imitate that great thing that you perceive. Now, you might say, well, how can you imitate the infinite cosmos as well? Obviously, that's a very complicated question. But, you know, you're a very complicated thing. And God only knows what it means for you to imitate the infinite when you apprehend it. I mean, that's, in some sense, that's the fundamental question of life. Is how do we adapt ourselves to the infinite complexity that surrounds us? What must we become? Well, you don't merely think that through. And I mean, you don't, I don't, human beings in general don't. We puzzle it out, and we use all sorts of information to do that. And some of these more primordial experiences that are outside the domain of strict rationality nonetheless point us in an ethical direction. And the ethic would be, you should and could be more than you are. Well, then the question is, how do you bring that to earth? How does that look when you try to embody it day to day? Well, I would say these are obviously not my ideas. They're very old ideas. Well, maybe you ally yourself with truth to the degree that you can. Maybe you pursue beauty. Maybe you pursue the love that attaches you appropriately to other people, etc., etc. And so, and you do that because, well, I think you do it because life is very, very difficult. I was talking to my wife the other day, and she's become very interested in Christianity, and she was talking about a set of mysteries that are part of the Catholic ritual, and one of the mysteries is Christ's bearing of his cross, and someone helps him. And this isn't I'm not speaking about this religiously. I'm speaking about it practically and psychologically. It's a remarkable story because it implies that human existence, like our subjugation to vulnerability, which is exemplified in that story, to be rejected by the crowd, to be betrayed, to be killed, that subjugation is so difficult that even God himself needed help. And so the question is that, and like I said, I'm not speaking religiously. I'm looking at the story in some sense as a psychologist. It's like, well, what does that imply? Well, it implies you have to call on you have to note when you're being called to be more than you are, and you have to attend to that very carefully, because life is extraordinarily difficult, and to manage it in a manner that makes it acceptable, or perhaps more than acceptable, you have to be everything you could be. So that's not exactly strength, right? It's way more than that. Strength is a way into it. It's a specific virtue. It's a way into the discussion of what constitutes the ideal. When I went on tour in 2018, before I went out, I thought I wanted to do this like 100% right, or at least as close to that as I could manage. So I went out and bought some expensive suits, and I spent way more money than I ever thought I'd spend on clothes, and I really felt quite bad about it. I thought maybe it was an extravagance, but I thought, no way, man, I'm gonna see if I can nail this dead on, and I'm gonna be speaking to 100,000 people. I'm gonna look as sharp as I possibly can. And one of the consequences of that has been that young men in particular come to the lecture tour dressed up in suits, three-piece suits. When the couples come and they're dressed up like they're coming to a wedding, so that's really something. And
why do you think that is? Is it because you set that
they're
standard?
Sick acting like kids.
Okay.
Our whole culture pushes the idea that teenage life, or even childhood for that matter, but teenage life is some sort of pinnacle, and then everybody dresses down so they look, especially men, they look like overgrown 10-year-olds, and there's something extremely demeaning about that. And so to provide people with the opportunity to dress up in a classic manner and to look like adults, to present themselves in that manner, there's something very attractive about that, because we haven't done that in our culture. That's been, I would say, downplayed in importance or for certainly since the 1960s.
Who's to blame for that? Because you recall, anytime you would fly in an airplane, if you see old school pictures, people were dressed in three-piece suits to go on an airplane. This is in the 60s, I assume. Yeah. And then now you see someone like Mark Zuckerberg wear a t-shirt to give a speech in front of a TED Talk or something like that. So
well,
who's to blame for this dress
some
down?
of it's just fashion. Fashion moves around, and it usually drifts from the top down, and so when formality becomes the norm, but that drifts down to, say, to the working class, then the upper class thinks, well, we can't do that because that would associate us with the unfashionable people, and then they dress down, and so then that drifts down the hierarchy. And so there's some of it's just fashion, but a lot of it too is this idea that this sort of reflexive, rebellious attitude that anything that violates traditional norms, or even anything that's associated with patriarchal oppression and adulthood, is to be eliminated in favor of what's hypothetically a more free individuality. But it's not, because everybody looks the same. I was in Washington 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer than that. It's probably longer than that, when I first went in the summer. And one of the things that really struck me, all these people wandering around these great monuments, is all the men looked like overgrown 10-year-olds. They looked exactly like their kids, except they were bigger. They looked like they'd been inflated with a bicycle pump. And I thought, this is weird that adults are dressing like children, and not good. And so some of it's fashion, but some of it's also that.
Is it exclusive in America? How about in Canada? What have you seen all over the world with this?
No, I don't think it's exclusive to America. I think it was more noticeable to me in Washington, and I think that's when it really hit me, because Washington is, in some sense, a place of pilgrimage, and people from every class go there, and that's a good thing, and they should, from every economic class. And so it was like it was a real cross section of the total population, and that was one of the things that struck me quite bluntly. I talked to my father about this years ago, because he always wore a suit when he was a teacher. He's still alive. He's a teacher, and he always wore a suit. And I asked him why one day, and he said because it was his way of showing respect for the students. And I mean, I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't dress in the suit is being disrespectful, but there's something about outfitting yourself for the task at hand. And there's also something about attempting to put some effort into putting your best foot forward. And I don't really buy the it takes more time in the morning argument. It takes a bit more time, but once you, before I went on this tour, I went through all my clothing and I tossed out everything that didn't fit, and which included a number of suits that were old, and I had to organize them, and that took about a day to get my closet in order. I started buying nice clothes, let's say, this year, really. I had some decent suits before that. I did some research online to find out who good suit manufacturers were. You can look that up. But before this tour, I went and talked to a good tailor, expensive place. I felt terrible spending so much money on clothing. But I felt that if I was going to go talk to, it's been 200,000 people, that I was going to do it right, and I was going to invest in some decent clothes. And even though it hurt my cheap northern Alberta soul to do it. It was definitely worth it. So you go talk to someone who knows what they're doing. Go talk to an actual tailor, and you can do some research online. There's lots of resources online that are devoted to helping men figure out how to dress. 3-piece suits look really good. I've got them tailored and fitted, so they're not bespoke suits. They're off the rack, but they've been tailored, and that makes a big difference. All the subtle things that tailors do, they tuck it in around the waist, they cut it to your body. All of those things help. It's really good to have a good pair of shoes, a couple of nice ties. I learned how to tie a full Windsor knot recently, and that actually helps. You don't want your tie to look too skinny. Lots of people have been dressing up to come to my talk, so it's nice to see a lot of young men come well dressed, often in 3-piece suits, but not always, and it's really good to see them dressed like grown-ups. I think that's a real plus. I had a rule that I didn't write in 12 Rules, which was dress like the person you want to be. I kind of took that from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche said every great man is an actor of his own ideal. It's a very nice aphorism, and basically what it meant was that sometimes you have to act out what you want to be before you become it. You have to pretend. And it's not a lie. It's really a pretense, like children pretend to be a father before they grow up and become a father. It's a form of practice. And so tip 1 might be figure out who you want to be. Tip 2 might be, well, then dress like that person. That's a good start. And because I think if you want to become who you want to be, then no detail is too small to overlook. And certainly it isn't exactly that people judge you by your clothes, although they do to some degree. It's that if whatever you can have going for you, you might as well have going for you. That's how it looks to me. And certainly my experience has been that the response to my improved wardrobe has indicated that the investment was clearly worth it, indisputably and clearly worth it. And it's nice to be dressed sharply to go in front of an audience. It's a sign of respect to the audience. There's other ways of showing respect to an audience, but that's certainly one. And so it's been extraordinarily worthwhile. I would say if you're going for a job interview, if you're at any critical point in your life, then you should dress the part, because you want to do everything you can to tip the scales not in your favor exactly, but in favor of having the right thing happen. Physical attractiveness is extensively studied in departments of psychology. How big of a determinant of success is it apart from IQ or any of the other big 5 traits? That's tough one, because physical attractiveness is a very complex trait. It's also, for example, it's a marker of health, and of course health is a prerequisite for success. So we know that people who are physically attractive, though, are given the benefit of doubt by other people. They benefit from the positive halo effect, and the positive halo effect is the propensity of people to assume good things about someone if there is one outstanding thing about them that's easily evident, that's good. And so if you stand up straight with your shoulders back, so that's rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life, then people are going to see you as more attractive. If you're symmetrical, you're more attractive. If you're thin but not too thin, you're more attractive. And then there's like good skin and good teeth and good hair and all of those things, and proper proportions and youth, and there's a whole slew of things that feed into that. If you are characterized by a plethora of those features, then people are also going to assume that you're more competent and more worth having around, let's say. But the problem is that you are. So separating out the attractiveness from the things the attractiveness is correlated with is very hard. That's why you have to do multivariate analysis. That's multivariable analysis in any complex social science, because a lot of these traits overlap. So, but you can there's some things you can do about that. Postural adjustment is helpful. To work out with weights, that's extraordinarily helpful. That improves your posture and makes you more confident, and you can dress reasonably well and intelligently, and all of those things to help yourself capitalize on whatever attractiveness you can muster.
So Zazu, the eyes of the king, comes to check out the king, and that's
Mufasa, yeah, and he's a very regal-looking person, lion, and he stands up straight and tall, and that means that he's high in serotonin, because serotonin governs postural flexion, and if you're dominant and near the top of hierarchies, you tend to expand so that you look bigger than you could if you shrunk down. And so if you're a low dominant person, you wander around like this so that you look small and weak, and you don't pose a threat to anybody. But if you're at the top, you expand yourself so that you can command the space, and that's why he has that particular kind of regal posture. And if you look at his facial expression, you see that it's quite severe. He's capable of kindness, but he's also harsh and judgmental, and that's what society is like. That's what the superego is like. And what that means is that he's integrated his aggression. And I've seen this happen in my clinical clients when they come in and they're too agreeable. They look like Simba looks later in the movie when he's an adolescent, and he's sort of like a deer in the headlights. Everything is coming in and nothing is coming out. But when the person integrates their shadow and gets the aggressive part of themselves integrated into their personality, their faces harden. And if you look at people, you can tell, because the people who are too agreeable look childlike and innocent, and the people who, well, a hyper-aggressive person will look, mean and cruel. But I've seen people's face change in the course of therapy, men and women. And what happens is they start to look more mature, and it's more like they're judging the world as well as interacting with it properly once they integrate that more disagreeable part of them. It's very, very necessary, and that's part of the incorporation of the Jungian shadow.
When I wrote my first book, I wrote it over about I started it really in 1984 and I finished it in 1999, so 15 years. And I wrote pretty much 3 hours a day, every day. And I thought about what was in that book manically, I would say, hypomanically anyways, for at least 12 of those years. So I was just thinking about it all the time. Well, not all the time. I was doing some research in other areas at the time, but that all tied into it. So pretty much all the time. And I was obsessed with the Auschwitz phenomenon, I would say, obsessed with atrocity, but psychologically, right? Not economically, not sociologically, none of that, I thought. Trusty Auschwitz guard committing atrocity. There's one famous story that I came across. I think it was in Man's Search for Meaning, Frankel, but it might not have been. So, the people who came to the concentration camps who were transported, they were transported in cattle cars essentially, and many of them in the winter froze to death if they were on the outside of the cattle car, or were suffocated in the middle. And they were separated from their families, and there were people of different nationalities and different language families all crammed together, so they were as alienated and broken as people could possibly be. And you'd think that'd be enough, really, wouldn't you? But no. You come to the camp, and the people in the cars would cheer if they came to a camp that had no chimney. And so that shows you what joy is like under those conditions. So one of the tricks that the guards used to play in Auschwitz was they'd get these people after this brutal transport to pick up like 100-pound sack of wet salt and carry it from one side of the compound to the other and back. And compound, that's not like an area this size. Those places were small cities. They had 50,000 people in them, some of the camps. So it was a walk across town after you'd been separated from your family and just about froze to death and were 3/4 dead and had everything stripped away. It's like, just who the hell did you have to be to then subject that person to work for no other reason than to prolong their suffering, right? Because Solzhenitsyn said, when he was in the camps, that at least if he was laying bricks in a wall, or a bricklayer was doing so, at least he had the satisfaction of building something, right? There was some tiny iota of meaning in the work, something redemptive in that, a crumb that you could feast on in the midst of your starvation. But whoever came up with this particular torment figured out how to make work itself counterproductive, right? Work itself nothing but a means to more suffering. And you remember the joke on the outside of the Auschwitz camp, work will set you free. Someone made a joke about that. I wanted to think about just exactly what would you have to be like to make that joke? And part of the reason I wanted to figure that out is because I'm a human being, and a human being made that joke. And a human being forced that punishment onto someone who was already suffering. And I wanted to figure out what you would have to be like, what I would have to be like to do that. I thought if I could figure that out, then I could figure out what the opposite of that was, right? Because maybe such things should be brought to a halt. That's what we were supposed to remember from the concentration camps, which we're continually reminded never to forget as well. You do not remember what you cannot understand. And so we think, well, evil people did this, and hey man, fair enough, But don't be so sure that those people aren't you. And so that's a horrible thing to contemplate, but a necessary thing to contemplate. And I would say also that if you don't contemplate it, you end up placing that great evil somewhere else, right? In some other person, in some other race, in some other political party. That's going somewhere. And if it's not part of your own heart and the fight isn't there, well, you're going to have the fight somewhere. So I thought about that for a long time, and then what I concluded was that the way out of that is to make better people at the individual level. It's a psychological issue, fundamentally, not a sociological issue, not an economic issue, certainly not an economic issue, not a political issue. It is all those things to some degree, not fundamentally. There's no political reason to have some suffering person under your dominion carry a sack of wet salt that weighs 100 pounds from one side of a compound to another. No, that's you, man, corrupt right to hell. And so, you think that's pretty terrible, and it is pretty terrible, but there is one advantage to specifying evil in a very distinctive and precise manner, is that when you specify something that precisely, you also specify its opposite. Right? So if there's evil of that depth, then, well, there, at least in principle, might be the opposite of that, which would be the force that might resist it. And so while I was looking into the heart of darkness, let's say, the light started to shine through. And, partly when I started to understand, it was a little bit before that you should not lie. That's a big mistake. You think you can, first of all, I'll tell you one thing, that I never saw any of my clinical clients ever get away with anything, ever. We track their misery back to its origination point, and sometimes it was a mistake on their part, often a moral error, which they knew was a moral error when they were committing it, but may have forgotten about afterwards, so it became unconscious in some sense, or habitual, or it was a moral error that someone else that they were beholden to, a lie on the part of their mother or father, someone they were tangled up with, someone malevolent. But yeah, the pigeons come home to roost, man. And how could it be otherwise? You really think you have the capacity to bend the structure of reality without it eventually snapping back and hitting you in the face? Like, how arrogant can you possibly be to think that? And so, well, I came to believe that truth in particular, spoken truth, but not only spoken truth, was the antidote to that evil and to that suffering. Really, truly the antidote to that. It's more complex than that, but that's something. And I also came to believe that each of us have far more under our dominion in terms of the destiny of the world, let's say, than we would ever even care to dare to dread, let's say. I don't know how it works, but each of us, we make decisions between heaven and hell all the time. With every decision, in fact. With every decision. That's a decision, up or down. And in some manner, the whole collective enterprise is guided by those individual decisions. And it's not washed away in the mix, it's somehow not just your trivial action in a sea of 7 billion random actions. We're networked, and our actions echo, and what we do or don't do, or what we do deceitfully, has ramifications far beyond what we can immediately see, or often are willing to immediately see. It's like, the only more frightening realization than nothing you do matters is the realization that everything you do matters. It's like you want to pick an existential terror. You think meaninglessness is terrifying. You try its opposite and you'll see how terrifying that is. But it's a terror, it's a holy terror, right? It's a terror that sustains and ennobles. And every single person knows that that is true. Knows that you're fleeing from your destiny by avoidance of the necessary responsibility that your conscience calls you towards. And we toy with it because we can, and we try to avoid it because we test, we're immature, and we're bitter often, and it's not surprising because people suffer dreadfully, and it's very difficult to suffer dreadfully without becoming bitter, but it doesn't help. All it does is make the suffering worse and spreads it, and if the suffering is morally objectionable, spreading it is hardly going to rectify that. And so, I'm optimistic about our possibilities because I think we can do anything we set our minds to. And so, hopefully, we'll set our minds to the proper things. And every single one of you have to make that decision.
With regard to sexuality, you said that it is a good question to ask yourself. Who is in control? Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? If you're masturbating to pornography and the consequence of that is an immediate influx of guilt, then you have to ask yourself who's in control. And that's a really important question, who's in control. That's what terrified me about developing some psychoanalytic acumen, because once you realize that you're a house that many spirits can and do inhabit, and that many of them aren't you, and that many of them aren't working towards the purposes you might want yourself to be working to, that's the realization of the myth that you're embodying from the Jungian perspective. It's a very, very serious question. The fundamental human myth is Cain versus Abel. And so who are you? Are you Cain or Abel? Well, the answer is you're both. And then the question is, well, who's got the upper hand? And then the next question is, who do you want to have the upper hand? Is it God and Abel or Satan and Cain? And that's a question that's just as germane to non-believers as it is to believers. And isn't that remarkable and appalling and overwhelming and terrifying all at the same time, if you have any sense of what it means? So, if your behavior is embarrassing you, well, there's only two possibilities, isn't there? You shouldn't be so embarrassed. And I suppose the voice that says yes to all expression of human sexuality would say that your guilt and shame is merely the detrimental hangover of an oppressive patriarchy that's judgmental in its attitudes towards sexuality. Well, what would you use judgment to differentiate if it isn't sexuality? So I don't think that argument goes anywhere. You have to consult your own conscience. Like, I know the conscience can become an oppressive force on its own. That's the indwelling of the great tyrant, and Freud made much of that, a too oppressive superego. And I've certainly seen clients whose expression of healthy sexuality was inhibited by a too rigid superego. That can definitely happen. But that doesn't mean that all guilt about all forms of sexual expression constitutes a superego run amok. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there was some relationship between the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which, according to Randy Thornhill, by the way, who's perhaps the world's top biological thinker on this particular topic, Thornhill believed that the liberalism of the 60s was a consequence, at least in part, and in large part, I should say, of the hygienic revolution of the previous 6 decades and more that enabled us to reduce the impact, at least in the West, of infectious diseases. And because we were much less prone to the transmission and receipt of infectious diseases, we could afford to be more liberal by the 1960s. So we got more sexually liberal. And what happened? AIDS. And I say that without prejudice. And what's the most effective means of facilitating the reproduction of a deadly virulent agent and its propagation through the population? Unrestrained sexual behavior. Sexual shame is there for a reason, and it's not a trivial reason. And it's not just going to go away because we may wave the magic wand and make the patriarchal oppressor vanish. And that's not going to happen either, by the way. So if you're ashamed about your sexual behavior, then you have to ask yourself, is the shame wrong or is the sexual behavior wrong? And I'm asking you, I'm not judging your behavior, because what the hell do I know about you? And I have enough trouble with my own behavior. So, this is on you. Is your shame what you should be dispensing with, or the behavior? And, it might be a little of column A and a little of column B, because life is never simple. But if you don't feel ennobled by your porn-related masturbation, then perhaps that means it's of questionable utility. I certainly don't see it as a stabilizing social force. I don't see it as something people do in public and brag about. And I know that sexual behavior is private and should remain that way, but you get what I'm driving at. So, look, I think people shouldn't lie, especially to themselves. And I think repeatedly engaging in a behavior that you judge yourself to be morally reprehensible is a form of performative contradiction, which is the acting out of a lie. And I suspect you know that, or you wouldn't be asking the question. And so, what should you do with pornography? Well, you know the answer to that, and so does everybody else. Everyone knows it's not good. It's not good for those who produce it. It's not good for those who participate, wittingly or unwittingly, because there's plenty of them, in its production. It's not good for its consumers, or certainly not the highest good. And what's the highest good? Sexuality incorporated within a functional, intimate relationship, bound by vows of mutual celibacy. And we all know that too. That stabilizes our families. It stabilizes our societies. It stabilizes our psyches. And so anything you do that isn't in service of that goal is likely to be counterproductive. And I suspect it's your own psyche, your own soul telling you that. So if your sexual behavior isn't an expression of your highest being, then it isn't serving you in the deepest sense. You're serving it. And that's what your shame indicates. So get out there and find a partner and commit to her or him. And do you have any advice on what to do with porn and masturbation? The less porn, the better. That's my advice. But let's make that more specific. To the degree that use of porn and masturbation is undermining your sense of yourself and providing you with a dearth of motivational reasons to get out there and engage with a real partner, then it's definitely not in your best interest, and that's what your conscience is telling you. And it's the expedient at the expense of the meaningful. Obviously, right? Obviously, there isn't any more obvious manifestation of the expedient at the expense of the meaningful than pornography and masturbation. And that's hardly a heroic path. So maybe the less of it, the better. I'm aware, by the way, of the statistics showing that the introduction of pornography into a community doesn't raise but lowers rape probability. I think that's a separate discussion from this, but I just want you to know I'm not ignorant of that. Who's in control? That's the issue. Is it you, or is it the sexuality that's in control? Have you integrated your sexual life into the rest of your life so that the whole thing makes a harmonious balance? And are you in charge, or is it in charge, so to speak? Because if you're not in charge with that harmonious balance, then things are going to waver wildly out of control, and you're going to find yourself in dreadful trouble. That happens whenever any given drive or really any given value predominates to the exclusion of all else. Now, it seems to me that sexuality is best handled within the confines of a relationship. That's the classic ethical solution to the problem. It's because sexuality brings with it a tremendous amount of responsibility. Now, people don't like to think that, especially people who I would say are low in conscientiousness, let's say, or high in impulsivity. It's easy for people to believe in, what would you call it, casual sex, which is not something that I think exists, because I don't think you can divorce sex from its sociological or political or economic or psychological consequences. There's no such thing as casual sex. I think the reason for that is that the consequences of sex are too dramatic. It's not just pregnancy and disease, let's say, which are both as dramatic as consequences can be in life, but also the fact that there's no disentangling sexual behavior from emotional behavior. Or maybe you could say even worse, if you try to disentangle your sexual behavior from your emotional behavior, then I think what happens is that you end up cold and cynical. I mean, if you're, let's say, if you're a serial, if you have a lot of one-night stands and a lot of casual partners, then first of all, there's not much discrimination between one partner and the other, and so in some sense you're in a loop and just repeating the same act over and over. But you can't, there's nothing deep about it. There's nothing that enables you to establish a relationship with another person. And I think that I think that you corrupt your soul in that way, and that you hurt yourself across time, and of course you're going to hurt other people as well. So I'm not a big admirer of the casual sex idea. I think it's a demented adolescence fantasy, fundamentally. It just doesn't work out in the real world. Now, healthy self-restraint, well, with regards to sexuality, it's the same with everything else, is that there's the necessity to forego immediate gratification for the purpose of medium to long-term thriving, let's say. So if your sexuality is integrated in an ethic that encompasses the rest of your life, and if it serves that ethic, then I would say it's properly restrained. If it's unhealthily repressed, well, then you're angry and bitter and resentful and cursing the opposite sex, or perhaps the same sex if you happen to be gay, for failing to recognize your particular form of sexual, what would you call, attractiveness. I think resentment and anger are a good indication that there's something wrong with the manner in which your sexuality is restrained. If you ask for something, it will be given to you, right? It's a very strange idea, but I like that idea a lot, and I believe, in my experience, that has been true. If it was that I wanted what I was asking for, because that's the real issue, right? Because the question is, if you want something, what does it mean to want it? And what it means is to sacrifice whatever is necessary to get it, because otherwise you don't want it. And so there's an equation here, and I'm not claiming its ultimate accuracy, but the equation is something like, you don't want it unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. And if you don't want it, you're not going to get it, because you're scattered. But if you do want it and you make the proper sacrifices, then God only knows what might happen. And that's see, one of the things I really like about the existential philosophers is their emphasis on personal responsibility. You know, many of them had an emphasis on the role that people had in shaping their own destiny. For the existentialists, and I think this was a consequence of the religious substructure of philosophical thinking, it was self-evident that life was tragic and bitter. And fair enough, but that isn't where it ended. The next issue was, well, there are better and worse ways of dealing with that, and the better way of dealing with the fact that life is tragic and bitter is to posit the self you could be and live authentically in relationship to that. And then the next issue, and this is something Kierkegaard talked about, particularly when he talked about the necessity of being a knight of faith, is that the thing is, and this is, I think, part of life that's the intractable adventure. No one can take the adventure of life away from you. They can't do it with good advice, for example, because no one can demonstrate to you that if you straighten yourself out and aim at what you want and make the proper sacrifices, that your life will turn out in the manner that you might want it to turn out. It isn't in anyone else's purview to make that judgment. The only person that can possibly figure that out is you. It's something that can't be stolen from you. I would say it's your destiny. It's a destiny that cannot be stolen from you. And you can forego it. You can say, well, I'm not willing to put in the effort, because what if I fail? Well, first of all, if you don't put in the effort, you will fail, because life is hard, and it takes everything out of you to do it properly. So you will fail. And if you make the proper sacrifices, you might fail. That's why I like the ambiguity in the story of Cain and Abel, because we're never really told why God rejects Cain's offerings. There's hints that Cain maybe isn't doing as good a job as he should, and he certainly gets bitter about it, but there's no smoking pistol. It doesn't say, well, Cain is a bad guy and he made terrible sacrifices, so God rejected him. You never know. Cain might have been working pretty damn hard and things still didn't work out for him, and I think that ambiguity is appropriate in the story, because that ambiguity is in life. You'd be a fool to say that everything always works out for everyone if they just do things right. I mean, I think that's a very careless thing to say, given how much tragedy and catastrophe there is in the world and how much of it seems to be undeserved. But that still has very little bearing, I think, on your own individual adventure and the necessity for opening the door to who you could be, and the necessity to do that seriously. And I do believe, and I think that's why this most impossible of verses, knock and the door will open, why that's believable is that I have never met anyone who couldn't hypothesize a better them in some manner. All they had to do was ask. It's like, well, how could you be better? Think, well, here's 3 ways. It's like, it's no problem, right? You can think about that in no time flat. Maybe it's small ways, but you can almost always at least think of something stupid that you're doing that you could quit. There's an idea that Jung developed about the trickster and the jester, the comedian, right? That the trickster is the precursor to the savior. That's one of the things I learned from Jung that was just, it's so unlikely. You'd never think that. It's so amazing that might be the case. But the satirical and the ironic and the troublemaker, the comedian, the fool is the precursor to the savior. Why? Because you're a fool when you start something new. And so if you're not willing to be a fool, then you'll never start anything new. And if you never start anything new, then you won't develop. And so the willingness to be a fool is the precursor to transformation. And that's the same as humility. And so if you're going to write your destiny, you can do a bad first job. You're going to get smarter as you move forward. That's the thing, is that, so something beckons to you. That's what happens here. Maybe the star that Geppetto wished on was the wrong damn star, but at least it was a star, right? At least it was in the sky. At least it moved him forward. And so you say in your life, well, something grips you and fills you with interest. And you think, well, should I do that? And the answer is, if not that, then something. What if it's a mistake? It's a mistake. Rest assured. What do you know? You're going to stumble around, right? And what's going to happen is this. You're going to not stay in stasis. You're not going to wander around in circles. And I see people like that. They said, well, I never knew what to do, and now I'm 40. It's like, that's not so good. That's not so good. And you might say, well, and there is a literature, too, that suggests that people are a lot more unhappy when they look back on their lives about the things they didn't do than they are about the mistakes they made while they were doing things. And so that's really worth thinking about, too, because there's redemptive mistakes. And a redemptive mistake would be a mistake that you make when you go out and try to do something. You think, okay, I'm going to try to do this. And you're not good at it. You make a bunch of mistakes. It's like, what's the consequence if you pay attention? Is you're not quite so stupid anymore. That's the thing, is you've been informed by the results of your errors. And so what happens is you follow the beacon, you follow the light. And you're blind, so you don't know where the light is. It's dimly apprehended only, and you're afraid to follow it. But you decide to take some stumbling steps towards it. And as you take stumbling steps towards it, you become illuminated and enlightened and informed because of the nature of your experience, because you're pushing yourself beyond where you are, and you're going into the country that you have not yet been in, and you learn something. And so what happens then is the star moves. You move 10 feet towards it, and you think, no, that's not right. I didn't get it right. It isn't there. It's actually there. And so then you see it somewhere else, and you shift yourself slightly, and you move forward. And that's what happens, is that you continue as you change. The thing that guides you forward moves, right? It's like God in the desert in Egypt. The pillar of light that you're following, it's moving. It's not a permanent thing. You move towards it, it moves away. It guides you forward. And so you say, well, is what I'm aiming at paradise itself? And the answer to that is no, because what do you know? You couldn't see paradise if it was right in front of you, but you might get a glimmer of it. And so you move towards it and you grow. And then the next time you open your eyes, you see a little bit more clearly. And that's what happens, is that just happens over and over, right? It keeps moving. And so you move like this. But the thing that's so cool is that all those zigs and zags, you say, and each of those zags and zigs is a catastrophe. I hit a wall, my God, and then I had to die a little bit, and I barely got back up. It's a phoenix transformation at each turn, and it's painful. But the thing is that even though you've traveled 20 miles, let's say, on that road, and you've only moved 3 miles forward, you've moved 3 miles forward instead of falling backwards, because that's the thing too, is that if you stand still, you fall backwards. You cannot stand still, because the world moves away from you if you stand still. And there's no stasis, there's only backwards. And so if you're not moving forwards, then you're moving backwards. And that's more of the underlying truth of the Matthew principle. To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's a warning. Do not stay in one place. Well, as you zig and zag, maybe the cataclysm of each transformation starts to lessen. There's not so much of you that has to die with every mistake. And maybe you end up oriented at least reasonably properly. And if you were sensible, that would have been your trip. But it wasn't, right? It's that. And perhaps it's a lot worse than that. Perhaps there's no shortage of backtracking. But it doesn't matter, because as you stumble forward, you illuminate and inform yourself. And perhaps that's partly because the world is made of information. And if you encounter it and tangle with it, then it informs you. And then you become informed. And then you're information. And then you're ready.